The idea of a creature lurking under the pale light of the moon in search of victims to drain of their blood has been the source of folklore and cultures all around the world for far longer than we have records of it, with traces from Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, and many others laying the groundwork for how we think of vampires in modern times. They came in many different forms, and there were limitless variations from culture to culture in the specifics, but those core ideas were always there. It wouldn't be until the 18th century that the vampire as we know it today would be formed in Europe, a portrayal that would be the base for Bram Stoker's seminal 1897 novel Dracula. In 1921, a German production studio called Piranha Film was formed by Enrico Dieckmann and Albin Groh, an occultist himself, with the studio intended to be focused on creating films bathed in occultism, but it only wound up producing one film and declared bankruptcy not long after it came out. That would be a story of failure in most cases, and at least for the studio's prospects as a business, it certainly was, but culturally, this film would be considered anything but a failure. The one and only movie ever produced by Piranha Film was Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau's Nosferatu, which released over 100 years ago in 1922, and despite the collapse of the studio after its release, it's one of the most important pieces of media to ever be released. It wasn't, as it's been hailed for a long time, the first vampire movie to ever come out, as it was quite recently discovered by film scholar Gary D. Rhodes that in 1915, a Russian film called The Afterlife Wanderer, directed by Viktor Torjansky, told the story of a vampire played by Olga Baklanova, a notable Russian actor early on in her career. Unfortunately, that film has been lost to time, with only 5 known images of it existing, and it's a real shame that this piece of history has been lost to time, especially considering its significance as the first time in history that a film about a vampire was made. At least as far as we know. Who knows what else has been lost? There were earlier films inspired by Bram Stoker's novel, like Dracula's Death, which released in 1921, but while that story did contain the characters of the novel, it wasn't actually about a vampire, but instead someone who believed themselves to be one. With all of that in mind, F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu can still be hailed as the earliest true vampire film that you can actually watch, and despite it being an unofficial and completely unauthorized adaptation of Stoker's novel, it was quite a success and did a lot to make Murnau a more well-known name in the industry. It also nearly suffered the same fate that The Afterlife Wanderer did, because after a long court battle over the film's unauthorized use of Bram Stoker's story, all copies were ordered to be destroyed, and the only reason that the movie survived is because of the handful of prints that were sent to the US, where a small discrepancy made it so that the copyright for the novel was never officially filed in that country. We came damn close to losing this monumental piece of cinematic history, but thankfully that didn't happen. One important element of this film is made clear in its full title, Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. It was made during the silent film era, and to ensure that the actors' performances would properly align with the film's score, Murnau used a metronome on set to keep things flowing rhythmically. The score was composed by Hans Erdmann, but most of what the German composer created for the film has also been lost, with only an adapted suite remaining, which has led to many takes on the soundtrack for this film in the years since Erdmann's was lost. James Bernard, Gillian Anderson, James Kessler, and Bernd Heller all either composed their own original scores or made attempts to reconstruct Erdmann's compositions and fill in the blanks by studying his style, with the most recent take being released in 2022, 100 years after the movie came out, by Dutch composer Josef van Wisem, who contributed a much more experimental and ambient score than the largely orchestral works that had come before. The Symphony of Nosferatu is an integral part of the film, and it's fascinating to watch the movie with these different takes on the soundtrack and see how it affects the overall tone of the experience, and it also opens up a great point of experimentation for musicians to try their hand at composing their own take on the soundtrack, or simply for those curious to curate a score to play alongside the movie. The film has been widely in the public domain since 2019, but there's a version from 1947 that has been in the public domain since its release. It lacks the restoration work done for some of the more modern releases, as well as the colorization used to indicate time of day and level of light, but there's something unique about the rougher black and white print that has a tone that I really love. This version also renamed the characters to match the ones found in Stoker's novel and features simpler intertitles. Nosferatu is not a totally faithful adaptation, with many deviations from the original novel, including character names, location, the way in which the vampire functions, its history, as well as some major deviations in the ending, but considering it's not an official adaptation of the novel, that isn't surprising, and it also means that the film still has a lot to offer for those familiar with the story of Dracula, and that's not to mention the distinct style present in Murnau's filmmaking that makes this still well worth watching over 100 years after its release. This is one of my earliest memories with any horror movie, and despite being an unofficial adaptation of the novel, I still think it's one of the best vampire movies ever made, and it's a strong contender for my favorite one, primarily thanks to its distinct tone and downright gorgeous visual style. So let's take a look at the film that changed everything for vampires, Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. It's important to note right away that Nosferatu is a silent film, so any dialogue or character interactions we have are either communicated through intertitles, which vary depending on the version you're watching, or simply through the performances giving you the necessary information about the nature of the interactions. Actors in this era tended to give more amplified theatrical performances in most circumstances, but this becomes especially the case when their physicality is all we have to go off of. The film makes up for the lack of any spoken dialogue and a large absence of diegetic sound through Murnau's absolutely breathtaking, perfect Gothic style, both in the sense that the visuals in the movie are absolutely gorgeous with such a great understanding of creating atmosphere through framing and lighting, but also through the downright stunning poetry of some of the intertitles. I love analyzing how the opening moments of a story set the stage for what's to unfold, and Nosferatu's first opening title contains this establishment of the dark grandiosity of Count Orlock, and especially when we look at the differences between Dracula and Orlock, this kind of thing is very effective. It reads, "Nosferatu, does this word not sound like the midnight call of the bird of death? Do not utter it, or the images of life will fade into pale shadows and ghostly dreams will rise from your heart and feed on your blood." You want to talk about setting the tone for a dark and ghostly Gothic nightmare? That kind of writing is present in many of the intertitles, and it's one of the biggest appeals of the film. Naturally, having to read in a movie is going to make it feel like you're reading. I know that's absolutely groundbreaking, but it gives this literary sense to the movie that stops it from feeling like annoying interruptions of the story, and instead like you're watching a poem unfold in front of you. I absolutely hate watching movies with subtitles unless they're in a language I can't understand, so you'd think that this kind of thing would bother me, but it's the exact opposite of that. I absolutely adore the poetic feel that this approach brings to the film, and it just elevates the strange and dreamy tone that the movie already has by placing these incredibly evocative lines in your head that genuinely adds to the imagery. My favorite example of that comes after Count Orlock takes over the Empusa, where it says, "Nosferatu's deadly breath filled the sails of the ship, speeding it towards its destination." Now, that imagery is certainly something that could be communicated through highly stylized and elevated visual storytelling, but there's something about having the specific words that the creator had in their mind while creating the scene that adds so much to it. It's amazing to me how much these intertitles can add to the imagery of the film. Oh, and by the way, Nosferatu is just a German word for vampire. Now, depending on which version of the movie you have, the quality of these intertitles will vary. Some have, basic black background on white text, while others have some more style to them with parchment textures and more interesting calligraphy. The version I have on Blu-ray has the stylized intertitles, but they look really cheap and digitally made, which is out of place with the rest of the film, while the version I'm using footage of here has more stylistically cohesive titles. On top of the score, this is another way in which people are able to use the film to test out how certain creative decisions can impact the tone, as you could, in theory, go in and create your own titles for the movie that align with your ideal presentation. Fun stuff. There are also differences between the style of the dialogue, people writing letters, and the more literary narrative stuff that helps to distinguish between them. The dialogue on the copy I have is this deep, eerie, moonlit blue color on a black background, and it's so wonderfully atmospheric. Moving on to the film itself. While this is an adaptation of Dracula and shares a lot with the novel and many of the adaptations that have come since, there is a ton that sets Nosferatu apart from the others, some of which I actually find more compelling than the source material. You can think of this as a more occult-focused and ghostly take on the story, and if you've watched my videos for any amount of time, you'll know that's a very appealing descriptor to me. Count Orlock isn't just an aristocratic vampire living in a castle. He was an occultist who practiced black magic in his human life and was eventually turned into this monster by the demon Belial. No, not that one, but fuck yeah, basket case is awesome. The character's ties to the occult are made pretty clear by the blatant symbols on the paperwork in his house, which, even without being able to comprehend what they mean, you can piece together that they're tied to some creepy stuff. To add to the feeling of creepy authenticity here, as the people behind this movie were into the occult, the letters between Count Orlock and Nock are written in Enochian, a language that was documented in the 16th century that two occultists used to communicate, and it's thought to be a language used by angels before spoken language came into being. Really interesting stuff there. Something that I find especially impressive about Count Orlock is how drastic the shift from his initial human portrayal to his knightly deathbird look is, considering there really aren't any changes in the makeup. It's all down to how he's filmed and what he's wearing. He obviously looks wrong when we first meet him, but the difference between him here with his hat on and this here when he's stalking Thomas is astounding. Just exposing the ears and the off-putting shape of his head while having Max Schreck adjust his physicality transforms this character from an off-putting and creepy dude to absolute nightmare material, and that's something that I find really impressive, and it's a testament to the artistry of Murnau's filmmaking as well as Max Schreck's incredible ability as an actor. Now, that's not to say that he isn't off-putting during the day, because he certainly is, especially when you get that strange realization that the coach that picks Thomas up seems to just be Count Orlock. The body language he has walking out of the castle to greet Thomas when he first arrives looks like he's spent the last 100 years wrapped up in some dusty corner somewhere and is now walking for the first time in a century. Like, he's completely unfamiliar with how a human body is meant to be handled. He feels like that very bird of death that's talked about in the opening title, When the Night Falls, with one of my favorite touches in the performance being that we only ever see him blink twice on screen, with one of those times being almost unnoticeable because of the angle and the fact that we're dealing with a movie filmed in 1922 and there isn't as much fidelity. That's another way in which it feels like Schreck played the character as if he'd forgotten the functions of a normal human body, with the first blink being this performative thing to try and seem more human as he's meeting Hutter for the first time, and the second when he's brought back to the raw ferality that awakens within him when he's caught off guard by the blood coming from Thomas's thumb. He was asking for it cutting bread like that. It should be criminal. It's criminal. Something else that sets Count Orlock apart from Count Dracula is that when he bites people, they don't transform and join him in the vampiric curse. They simply die after being drained of their blood, which means that the whole way through, Orlock is the only vampire in the story. He's not entirely on his own, however, with one of the elements of his character reflecting fears of the plague that were so common at the time. The Count travels with multiple coffins, one for him and the others filled with plague-ridden rats. And he uses these to torment different communities that he comes across on his journey to Germany. Despite not being able to use his voice to bring anything to the role, Schreck's performance as Count Orlock is without a doubt one of the greatest vampire performances of all time, thanks to just how good he is at that physicality. And he's also been the source of many of the most iconic images in horror, and really just filmmaking in general. It's not only Max Schreck who gives a great performance though, with Gustav von Wangenheim in the lead role of Thomas Hutter also doing a really great job at portraying the gradual shifts his character goes through of being happy-go-lucky and excited at first, and slowly descending into the horror of what he comes face to face with. What really works about this version of the character is how full of life and excited he is, making it feel all the more tragic when this seemingly innocent person is cast into a place as deeply hellish as Orlock's castle. Alexander Granick as Nock is also fantastic at playing this absolutely batshit insane, erratic lunatic who's been driven mad under the spell of Count Orlock, waiting for the arrival of his master in Germany and passing the time eating bugs. I'm gonna expand more on this in a bit at the end of the video, but I honestly like a lot about what Murnau did with these characters more in a lot of cases than the source material it was based off of, particularly with the creepy occultism of Count Orlock, and especially with Thomas's wife Ellen, who has a much more significant role to play in the story thanks to the fact that she has real agency in the way things conclude. We have all the things we've come to expect with her, being the one left behind when Thomas goes to the castle and being drawn in by the spell placed on her by Orlock as his obsession develops after seeing a photograph of her. For the vast majority of the movie, she's basically just sitting around moping and waiting for Thomas to return home because it's 1922 and women weren't allowed to function if their husbands weren't around. Now, if this was what her character was relegated to for the whole movie, I wouldn't have much to say about her, but that's thankfully not the case. Towards the end of the film, she finds a book that details some of the history and mythology about vampires, and learns that in order to make sure Orlock's reign of terror can be stopped, she may have to sacrifice herself since she's the one he's the most drawn to, and if she allows him to feast on her blood, he'll be so distracted by the ecstasy of it that he won't realize the sun is rising and he'll be killed by its touch. I will talk more about that in a bit, but just presenting this dilemma for the character gives her a lot more of a role in the story outside of being the reason that others are trying to kill the vampire. Now, I'm clearly pretty fond of a lot of the character and narrative adjustments in this movie, but the biggest reason that I think this movie is still a strong contender when placed up against some of the other giants of the adaptations of Stoker's work is in the absolutely stunning Gothic and ghostly style of Murnau's direction and the deep occult magic that seeps out from every moment of the film. Part of this dreamy feeling is absolutely thanks to the very aged look of the film, as well as the fact that, it's a silent movie, there's this uncanny disconnection from the characters, and there's also something oddly alluring about knowing that basically every living thing you see on screen is very much more than likely already dead. It's a very creepy feeling. But those elements aren't the only reason the film has its tone. There is a timeless quality to the way that Murnau approached telling this story, and it's particularly in the lighting and the way shadows are used that give that strange magical quality to each scene. If you want to talk about dreamy Gothic horror, Nosferatu is one of the main movies it should be focused on, and with images as iconic as his reveal on the Impusa during his transport to Germany and his shadow creeping up the stairs to Ellen's room, it's really hard to make any case for the contrary. Aside from those museum-worthy images, there are many shots here that don't even have Count Orlock in them that are some of my favorites, like this image of Ellen on the balcony in the dead, eerie night with deep blue color glowing from the faint light catching on the branches outside while she's drawn into the darkness as Count Orlock calls to her from far away. The film, of course, wasn't shot with these colored tints, but good God, do they ever lend themselves really well to creating the film's dreamy tone, with the warm pink and yellow of the lighter scenes and the eerie blue or sickly green of the night. Such an effective way to build an atmosphere. Honestly, what may be my favorite image of the whole film is Ellen sitting on the beach in her black dress and watching the ocean as she awaits the return of Hutter, her dressings blowing in the wind and the cross in the distance sticking out of the sand. This is just gorgeous, and you can almost feel Orlock reaching across the ocean waves to grab at her. In fact, it seems like a common through line that pretty much all of my favorite shots in the movie involve some sort of implication of Orlock's influence over Ellen, and I think that's because of how much dark magic there is bleeding through that element of the movie's narrative, all portrayed in a way that's so conducive to that core. The shot of him watching her from the window of the house he bought from across theirs is so ridiculously creepy as well. That, as it's put in Robert Eggers' upcoming remake, Gothic tale of obsession is what makes Nosferatu such an engaging watch after all these years. The other side of that is that the film captures the warmth of the earlier scenes extremely well too, with moments like Thomas telling Ellen about his job opportunity being painted in this warm yellow in a lovely sunlit room with sheer curtains blowing in the background. There's a really vibrant joy that's brought through thanks to the film's style as well as the performance from Wangenheim as Thomas. Despite the news upsetting Ellen, you can really feel how joyous Thomas is at the prospect of this opportunity. So while the film does the dark Gothic feel extremely well, there are also these calmer and more gentle moments that it captures with equal success. And there's also the way that Murnau captures the unsettling landscapes of the Carpathians with this earthly horror. It's all nothing less than stunning. This is one of the best pieces of cozy horror escapism for me, but a lot of that is surely because of the nostalgia I have for it. Now, before I get into the film's ending, because I've spent this whole video doing everything short of cupping Count Orlock's balls, I should at least throw a bone and say that while a lot of the movie really holds up well, there are a couple of lines that are pretty silly that come from Count Orlock, but I do think that there's a reason for that. The main one for me is when he sees the picture of Ellen when he's first meeting Hutter and he says, "Your wife has such a beautiful neck." It's one of those things that seems really goofy and on the nose now, but it's at least worth mentioning that film as a medium was far less subtle in the way it presented its narrative information than a lot of what we've had in the century since, because media literacy wasn't something that had really been formed in a wide enough audience to assume it was safe to not spell things out and still give the audience the necessary information. People were certainly more familiar with vampires after Stoker's novel than they were before, but I think it's understandable why this wouldn't feel like something really on the nose while they made the movie back in the 1920s, but despite all the very valid reasons for why some of these elements are in the movie, it doesn't really change the fact that there is some unintentional humor at certain moments. The start of Orlock's obsession with Ellen should ideally be a haunting moment where we see this dark seed planted in his mind, but instead, it's one that makes me chuckle a bit because of that line. That being said, there is also something very quaint and charming about the innocence of this sort of presentation. So while it doesn't have quite the intended effect anymore, it doesn't ruin the movie or take me out of it. Now, looping back around to what I was talking about with Ellen having more agency in this version of the story, Orlock's brief time in Germany brings absolute chaos and plague to the locals, forcing them into isolation and causing a witch hunt for Knock, who manages to break his way out of his cell by murdering the guards. People are dying left and right, law and order are failing, things are overall very bleak for these people. And so with the knowledge that Ellen gathered from this book, she decides to make the ultimate sacrifice to free them from this horror that Orlock has brought on them. She's seen him watching her and knows that his obsession is directed towards her, so she allows him to sneak into her room in the night and take her life. Now, in Stoker's original novel, vampires were fine to roam during the day and could be exposed to sunlight, although they would still avoid it and cover up as much as possible. It actually wasn't until this movie that the idea that vampires would die when exposed to sunlight was introduced, and that's what allows Ellen to make this sacrifice for the greater good. The change was made largely to try and have a stronger case for the inevitable copyright battle that would follow the release of the film, with the thought process being that if the ending was different and the nature of the creature was altered that much, they would be able to argue that it's not copyright infringement. Now, it didn't work, of course, since all copies were ordered to be destroyed, but what it did do is introduce an element to many vampire depictions that would follow, and also inadvertently altered some of the core definition of vampires in folklore, which is really interesting. So Ellen pretends to be sick so that she can get Thomas to go off and find a doctor for her, knowing that he won't allow her to do what she plans to do, and she times this sacrifice to begin just before the rising sun, knowing that Orlock will be so consumed by his indulgence that he won't notice the light creeping up over the horizon, and by the time it touches him, it's too late. I absolutely love this change to the film's ending, both because of how it allows more relevance for Ellen's character, but also because we get to see just how inhuman and also insectile Orlock looks when he's draining the blood from the neck he so coveted. It's really unsettling. Count Orlock realizes after it's too late that the sun is now out, and when it catches him by the window, he turns to dust in the rays, and Ellen dies in Thomas's arms in the early morning. The film comes to a close with one final title detailing the triumph of the sun, and we then see the ruins of Orlock's castle, now nothing more than rubble on the mountainside in the Carpathians. There are so many different takes on Stoker's novel that it's really hard to try and figure out which one did it best, since they all have their strengths and own ideas brought to the table. Coppola's grand and theatrical version is one of the most stylistically gorgeous films ever made. Fisher's version delivered an amplified take with Christopher Lee's defining performance as the titular character. Browning's version forever shifted how vampires would go on to be portrayed in media, but for me, Murnau's unofficial adaptation is potentially my favorite for its deeply magical and ethereal moonlit eeriness. I absolutely adore Count Orlock's portrayal here from Max Schreck, posing for some of the most iconic and timeless images in film history. The changes to the story's ending are just fantastic, and the overall style of the film is so perfectly aligned with my taste in Gothic horror. I also love how well it captures the warmth of some of the happier moments of the story, and despite some unintentional humor, the film's overall tone has aged pristinely. Thank God there were surviving prints of this thing, because we damn near lost one of the most important films ever made. I hope that someday the Afterlife Wanderer may show up somewhere, somehow, but chances of that are second to none. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell, because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members, who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.